Welcome back to You Have a Brain by Dr. Ben Carson. Enjoy reading. Chapter 2. Think Beyond the Can. I don't recall the first time my mother asked me, "Do you have a brain?" I heard it voiced or inferred so many times growing up that it's impossible to remember all the occasions, let alone arrange them chronologically. However, one childhood incident always leaps to mind whenever I think about that all too familiar question from my youth. My brother Curtis and I had received a BB gun as a gift, and we were anxious to try it out. After scrounging an empty tin can out of the kitchen trash, we headed outside for a little target practice. I took the can, and Curtis, since he was older by 2 years, carried our BB gun. In no time, we spotted the perfect setup. Instead of simply standing the can on a flat surface, we turned it upside down over the wire prongs sticking up from the woven wire fence across the alleyway. That way the can might rattle and vibrate, or maybe even spin on impact without sailing off the fence. We'd save ourselves the aggravation of chasing or picking up the target each time we hit it. Curtis took the first turn. I don't have any idea how many shots he fired before the can finally pinged. I'd watched The Lone Ranger and The Rifleman on television, and had good coordination and a steady hand. How hard could this be? I was certain I could do better than Curtis on my first round. But I didn't. I don't recall, and never really want to, how many of my shots missed before I finally heard the first tinny ping of success. It was harder than it looked on TV and downright impossible to adjust my aim when I couldn't always tell which way I'd missed. And it didn't help my concentration to have to tune out my brother's voice constantly offering advice. Still, our target practice became more fun and less frustrating as the frequency of our hits steadily improved, until we ran out of BBs and headed back into the house, discussing where we might collect enough change to purchase additional ammo. We still hadn't settled on a workable solution to our monetary shortage when a neighbor walked over to our house early that evening wanting to speak to Ms. Carson. He was carrying something long and flat. I couldn't tell exactly what it was until he tipped it up to show my mother. I'm not sure she realized right away exactly what he wanted her to see or why, but I did. And if I'd had a magic wand at the time, I would have waved it and poof. Curtis and I could have disappeared. I realized our neighbor was holding a section of screen from his back porch, a screen with lots of little holes in it, BB-sized holes. Clearly the screen had been in a direct line behind the fence, and the tin can we'd been shooting at much of the afternoon. From the look on the neighbor's face, he was not a happy man. Nevertheless, he politely inquired, "Ms. Carson, would you or perhaps your boys be able to explain this?" Curtis and I made eye contact. Mother hadn't been home earlier, so she knew nothing about our target practice, and we seriously doubted she'd had enough personal experience with BB guns to immediately recognize the damage for what it was. When she turned to us in search of an explanation, we had no choice but to confess. We were not going to lie to our mother, and we didn't want our neighbor to think she might have known anything about it. We admitted full responsibility, apologized profusely, explained what we'd done with the tin can and exactly how it happened. We desperately hoped the neighbor and our mother believed we hadn't intentionally damaged his screen. In fact, we had no idea that we had until he'd shown up with the evidence. Mother didn't say much. She looked more disappointed and maybe a little embarrassed than angry. The neighbor listened to our explanation and apology. He evidently believed our account of the incident because he accepted our apologies. But he wasn't about to shrug off the consequences of our behavior. "I'm going to have to replace this whole section of screen," he told us, "and I can't do that for free." Curtis and I told him we didn't have any money to pay for the damage. Looking back, I'm sure he already realized that, which might explain how quickly he proposed a solution. He'd buy the replacement screen, and once he knew how much it would cost him, Curtis and I could work off our debt by doing odd jobs around his house and yard until he thought we'd fulfilled our financial responsibility. We agreed that sounded fair to us. We realized, though, that Mother didn't think it was entirely resolved. No sooner had the man left than Mother turned, looked at us, and inquired, "Do you boys have a brain? You were shooting a gun toward someone's house. Did it not occur to you that you might miss the can sometimes? Did you not realize those BBs would have to go somewhere? Obviously, they went a lot farther than you intended for them to go, or imagined they would go. They could have hurt someone. But boys, you are both smart. You need to use the brains God gave you and learn to think beyond the can. Then she looked right at Curtis for a few seconds before she shifted her gaze to my eyes. Do you boys understand what I'm saying? We both assured her we did. We didn't feel quite so understanding when she ended the conversation by confiscating our BB gun and keeping it until we worked off our debt to the neighbor and showed her we could be more responsible. That certainly was not the last time our mother asked us, "Do you have a brain?" any more than it was the first. My mother would pose it like an unannounced pop quiz on all too frequent occasions throughout those first 18 years of my life, and I probably wouldn't have to think too hard to recall occasions she's asked that same question since then. A majority of my friends today would not be surprised to hear me say that most of the time I was a pretty nice, laid-back, easygoing, basically get-along kind of kid growing up. But I did have a temper which got me into more than my share of trouble at school. For example, I got into a scuffle one day with a boy who called me a name. Ordinarily, that wouldn't have bothered me. But this day, that particular name, long forgotten now, ticked me off, so I called him a name in return. He called me another name. One of us shoved the other. Someone yelled, "Fight!" and we went at it. We did a lot more pushing and grabbing than actual fisticuffs before a teacher pulled us apart. I suspect any scorekeepers in the crowd gathered around us probably judged it a disappointing draw. Of course, we both got sent to the office anyway, and the school called our parents. My mother couldn't get there to check me out, so I stayed until the end of the school day and walked home as usual. When Mother got home from work later, I saw concern and disappointment all over her face. She looked at me and said, "Let me get this straight. On the basis of somebody making a silly comment, calling you some name, you got into a fight that resulted in all this trouble at school?" I began to tell her how the other kids started it, but I hadn't finished my first sentence when she shut down my explanation by asking, "Benny, do you have a brain?" I knew the response she expected, but why did she bother asking? I raised my eyes to look at her and softly replied, "Yes, ma'am." "Then you need to think, Benny." She wasn't through yet. "And I don't care what that other boy said or called you. His words shouldn't matter at all. They won't matter to anyone else tomorrow. They only mattered to you today because you let them. What really matters is how you respond your behavior. And you are the only one who can determine and control that, but only if you use your brain to look beyond the moment." My mother had a lot of ways to say the same thing, but I was struggling to put into words my own frustration and indignation that it was unfair how she always wants to shrug off others' role even when they are clearly to blame, and focus on my response instead. Why can't she see? Mother was still talking, and as her words interrupted my internal argument, it seemed almost as if she was hearing my thoughts. If you let others' actions and words determine what you do, there's no real point in having a mind of your own. Use that brain God gave you. There it was. I knew that was coming. To make your own decisions, to choose your own path. Don't let anything other people say or do rob you of that choice, that responsibility. Even in the heat of the moment, you need to use that brain to think. Don't let anyone else push you into doing something foolish or wrong that you'll regret as soon as the moment is over. Or tomorrow, maybe even forever. In other words, think beyond the moment. Look beyond the can. An awful lot of what Mother desperately wanted us to learn about life seemed to relate to that overarching theme of, you've got a brain, use it. She was big on taking responsibility. God had given us our brains, and with those brains came the ability to figure out which way the wind was blowing, and maybe even how to harness it for our own benefit. So, Curtis and I didn't hear that familiar question only when we'd gotten into trouble. It was often Mother's immediate, and sometimes only response when one of us would run to her, complaining about something the other had said or done. "Do you boys have a brain?" Yes, of course, we didn't even have to answer out loud. We might nod or simply lower our chins. Then surely you have the intelligence to settle this between yourselves. Or we'd be whining about a bike or something else that was in need of repair before we could use it. She'd just look at us and ask, "Do you have a brain?" Pause for effect. "Then I bet you can figure out what needs to be done to fix it." Sometimes she wouldn't say a word, but just give us her use your brain. Look. It got to the point that we didn't even bother to inform her about a lot of little things, like the fact that an essential piece of some game was lost. We'd just use our heads to figure out something we could use as a substitute. Excuses were another trigger occasion for Mother's familiar question. I just ran out of time to finish my math homework last night. By the time I got my chores done, it was bedtime, and I was just too tired to stay up any longer. Such explanations launched many a brain lecture about all manner of wisdom regarding the importance of prioritizing, managing time, taking responsibility for our decisions, behavior, life, etc. Whether life presented Curtis and me with irritating little problems and people or seemingly insurmountable obstacles, Mother routinely challenged us with the same question. The implication was always that since we did have brains, we were expected to find a reasonable way to deal with any issue. Somehow, despite her lack of formal education, she'd only finished the 3rd grade, or maybe because of what she realized she'd missed, my mother had as deep an appreciation, respect, and belief in the potential of the human brain as anyone I've ever known. She hadn't taken a single course in biology, anatomy, or neurological science. When I was growing up, she probably didn't even know there was a field of study called neurological science. Yet she was convinced that the greatest resource she, her 2 sons, and everyone else had been born with was our brains. The fact that we understood the assumptions and intent behind Mother's question didn't mean we liked hearing it. Curtis and I had heard the words so often that we sometimes dreaded the thought of plowing the same familiar ground one more time. Yet we never heard the question and took the words as an insult to our intelligence. We knew Mother believed the answer to her question was a resounding yes. She reminded us of that on a regular basis. We never took it as any sort of put-down or critical judgment of our mental capacities. More the opposite, in fact. Whenever I heard Mother ask if I had a brain, it reaffirmed her high expectations of me because we both very well knew that she believed I had a better-than-average brain. More than chastisement or reminder, the question served as a challenge for me. It instilled confidence and hope that if I would only make use of this resource I'd been given, I would be ready to deal with any hardship or challenge life threw at me. No matter what circumstances I faced, I had the opportunity to get out of bed every morning and think big. Since my mother believed that, so did I, which turned out to be no little thing. Some of the challenges we would face together would turn out to be huge. Thank you so much for joining us on this reading adventure on You Have a Brain by Dr. Ben Carson. We hope you've enjoyed our content and found it enlightening. If you've liked what you've seen and read, we'd be thrilled if you could give us a thumbs up, share our channel with your fellow book lovers, and subscribe for more amazing reading experiences. Until next time, happy reading.